Coming in today from the highest levels of the Russian federal government, from Vladimir Putin himself, the Russian government has basically called for a draft of 135,000 men to fight for Putin's war in Ukraine. This is officially the largest autumn conscription in 9 years, so nearly a decade of the Russian military. This isn't really just a one-off, it's more so pointing towards a trend of overall collapse of the Russian war effort militarily and at home as their society falls apart under the weight of combined sanctions and now a fuel and oil crisis as massive Ukrainian drone strikes hinder their ability to even produce enough gasoline to keep their local civilian economy afloat. Just for context, in spring of this year, Putin ordered 160,000 men to the front, which in its own right was the largest draft since 2011. If you combine those two numbers together, this recently released fall draft and the spring draft, that's a third of a million men that in this year alone Putin has called to the front to die in Ukraine. In previous wars, the draft limit stayed around 130,000 annually. So before the outbreak of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. So really what we're seeing is a doubling of the amount of men that Putin has basically sent to die in Ukraine against these incredibly tenacious Ukrainian defenders with their 4 years almost of war experience and their incredibly talented drone pilots and really their motivation to keep the Russians out of their country. As a whole, we're seeing draft numbers climb steadily, spring and autumn alike. They just kind of piecemeal go up and up and up. And in 2024, the conscription age range was expanded from 18 to 27 to 18 to 30, once again just widening the pool of people that Putin could suck into his war. And not only that, but the legal detriments of not accepting one of these summons, not heeding one of these summons to the front, has basically expanded, and it has led to a lot of dodging. People who receive an online summons and not even an in-person summons to fight for Putin in Ukraine, to join the Russian military, they can be held legally liable, which is bans on driving, property sales, any kind of business activity, or even further being rounded up by Putin's goons and forcefully pressed into service in Ukraine on one of these frontline units. And really what we see since the start of the war is a lot of these fresh conscripts given 2 weeks, if that, of training and sent against, as I said, incredibly resilient Ukrainian resistance, and just fed into the meat grinder. And it's really nothing has changed since the start in that aspect. It's just massive death on a scale not seen in any war anywhere in the world since the Second World War. So 80 years we're talking there, just the level of death that Putin's inflicting on the Russian people. We look at overall the demographic decline is that fewer young men are going to be able in the future of Russia to support the economy and to support the overall aging population. For those of you that aren't aware, when a population ages, they need people on the bottom, younger people, to work and thus generate tax to pay for the senior benefits, whether it's pensions or health care for the aging population. With Putin handicapping the youth of his nation, it's going to be significantly harder for his country in the future, with nearly 1 million casualties, I believe over 1 million casualties now on the Russian side. It's going to be incredibly difficult. More people are evading. They're either going abroad or fleeing these call-ups in a multitude of ways, leading to more money needing to be put in the hands of Putin's press gangs, basically, to go around and pull young men into the war. What we see is morale issues, rushed training, poor equipment, and reports of mass desertions, and just the level of which the recruitment fidelity has fallen apart. Russia now has dedicated units for people suffering from AIDS or hepatitis, so they do not infect the other ranks. Because usually in the United States or majority of militaries in the world, people, when they join the military, they go through medical testing and vaccinations, right? So they're not spreading diseases when they get into a combat or operations environment. And what we're seeing from the Russian side is a lack of even that basic level of intense vetting medically. And so people are getting to the front in a completely haphazard state where they're spreading diseases and hurting the overall functionality of the Russian military as a fighting force. And each draft is really just to to pack holes in Putin's endless meat assaults to absorb expensive Western ammunition and hope that the Ukrainian resolve will break, which what it seems like now it never will, with their incredibly advanced drone technology and their domestic production capabilities. Really, this massive conscription comes at a pivotal moment where usually the majority of Russian troops in Ukraine are under what we call служба по контракту, which is service by contract, which really means Russians who are down on their luck, or prisoners, or really just people who want to go pillage and murder in Ukraine with Vladimir Putin's checkmark over their head. They can go do that and receive a lot of money. I mean, I'm not really sure the exact amounts, but it's a lot of money compared, especially when the average Russian is making $250 a month, which is significantly less than anyone in the military of Russia would, and significantly less than anyone of the United States or Western Europe would, realistically. It's important to remember that Russia is not as developed as people can see it from the outside, and the average salary there is $250 a month, with lots of people living in crumbling infrastructure, as a lot of money is suctioned out to the guys on top, and it all goes to Putin. And so this служба по контракту is really not attracting enough people. As the truth gets out, how these Russian soldiers are treated in these meat assault waves, the abhorrent living conditions, the rampant disease, and just the overall negativity of their service, it's leading people to not even take that amount of money to the front. So Putin now has to rely on what he did in the early days of the war, which is conscription, to push people into this war against their will or at risk of economic detriments to themselves. So it really does show a collapse where the truth has gotten out to Russian people that serving your failing motherland is not worth it, and you will simply be treated as a piece of meat. We saw a few years back when Putin tried to institute a overall draft, a massive draft. There were massive protests in Russian streets, big cities, think St. Petersburg, Moscow, massive protests. Keep in mind, these Russian people weren't protesting against the war itself, or the what could completely be considered a genocide operation, as Ukrainian children are kidnapped and sent to Russia, bombing children's hospitals, churches, orphanages, and this isn't even to mention the mass graves found in Izum, the story of Bucha, which I'm sure you've all heard of, where a Russian unit went into a city and massacred, tortured, lots and lots of people. Or obviously the tragedy that is the city of Mariupol, a flourishing city on the Black Sea, industrial powerhouse of 500,000 people, which in a very short order was completely destroyed, razed from the ground up, with the mass graves expanding beyond the city limits, and these mass graves filled with what used to be families and normal people living their lives only for the crime of being Ukrainian were slaughtered en masse, indiscriminately. And these mass graves, once again, can be seen from space. That is just the level that this thing is, the level of this operation against the Ukrainian people as a culture, as an ethnicity, and their history. To turn what is currently Ukrainian free land into the Russian kleptocracy, to force these Ukrainians to be Russian for simply the crime of being Ukrainian themselves. So people in Russia did not protest against this. People in Russia only stood up and protest en masse when they were at risk of being affected by it themselves. So at the end of the day, Russians are not willing to protest against the abject human rights violations and the kind of sucking down of their entire country into a pit because of this war and its drastic economic detriments to Russian society, economy, I mean, really every aspect you can think of. So they did rise up in protest against not the war, but this general draft to be sent to die in Ukraine. And that's what we saw a few years back when Putin tried to do a similar thing. So as these overall conscriptions grow in number, I think that hopefully we see a rise of interior strife within Russia, even though there is genuinely a lot of support on the ground for this war. We see from a lot of Russian people, from Russian media, from really all parts of Russian society, we do see genuine support for this war, for the genocide of Ukraine. It's important to realize that the Russian people too are at fault. It's impossible to just put all the blame on Putin. So hopefully as we see conscription rise, there is internal pressure, not because of their duty to defend Ukrainians and against genocide and life, but with their refusal to go to the front and die for Putin's wars and die for his palaces and his riches, as they live in a failing state without basic infrastructure that they had even during the Soviet Union. So why does this signal a general collapse of Russia? Why is this another brick in the slowly crumbling wall of the Russian war effort, the Putin regime, and Russian society as a whole? Well, this is no longer drafting at normal levels. This is forcing ever larger call-ups just to tread water. Ukraine has been fighting for small villages outside of the city of Pokrovsk and all along the front in Ukraine for months now, as they threaten, saying they can take on NATO. They have been fighting for small villages, small gains, a large pocket of a Russian salient, which was recently cut off by Ukrainians a week or so back, is now completely surrounded and being gunned down by these fierce Ukrainian defenders. Basically, this is Putin's his last call, his last chance to get more men at the front to hopefully break through and have some kind of gains in this war that at this point don't seem truly possible. Instead of just attracting volunteers, the state is leaning on coercion. It's leaning on press ganging and forcing people economically, socially. I mean, you can't drive if you ignore these conscription notices. It's showing the state's overall weakness. The cycle is unsustainable. The more men they conscript, the more the system frays, militarily, socially, and economically. Just as we saw in the late Soviet Union, mass conscription in times of crisis risks undermining loyalty and accelerating the internal breakdown of the Russian state. The 135,000-man autumn draft is not just another number, it's a warning sign. It's another indicator of the Russian collapse. Russia is burning through its youth, it's stretching its society to its limits, and revealing how hollow the regime has become, willing to send thousands upon thousands of young Russians to the front every day to die for Putin's palaces. And it seems like so many of them are willing to do it. But eventually, Russia's going to run out of psychopaths. Or maybe they won't. Maybe to them it's enough of a high to go around and kill people and steal washing machines, or what Russians really seem to do when they make it to Ukraine. And hopefully this regime will collapse, and what we'll see is a collapse of Putin's genocidal war machine, and Russians will have a long period of reflection of how they got to this point. How they got to this point of abject genocide and terror, and how all of them sat on their hands while this went on. And the only time they stood up was when they were at risk of being affected by it directly. Every new draft is less a show of strength and more a symptom of collapse in motion. Thank you for watching.